Morning, friends. Good to be gathered with you again. I'm Dave Welch. And as we continue our study of the Psalms this morning, we're going to be intentionally looking at a different psalm than last week, obviously, because we talked about the first one. And today I'm choosing for us Psalm number 5. And a couple reasons why I've done that I want to share with you. The first is, of course, is that we're moving through the Psalms. I'm not going to go each one, and gives us an opportunity to look at some different things. Another reason is part of the theme of this psalm, I think, resonates well with me, and I hope will resonate with you all where you are at home right now. It is a very emotional psalm, and as I talked last week about the use of psalms and their expressions and an invitation into understanding our own emotions, this is one of those. It's given the title or the label of what's called an imprecatory psalm. And imprecatory is a big word, and it's basically a poem, or in our case, a psalm that is written that invites judgment or cursing upon one's enemy or destruction of one's enemy. We may look at some other more powerful imprecatory psalms later. They are a difficult genre of psalms for us, in that it's hard for us to weigh this understanding of this, our sense of God and loving, and the requesting, as you will hear in this psalm, for destruction of an enemy or the killing of someone. But the invitation I'm going to bring for us is the invitation to claim the raw emotion of this. This is a psalmist, again, because in that first section we believe it comes from David, that is writing with some real pain, who's been suffering, who has great and strong emotions that are being expressed here. The other thing, reminding from last week, that the Hebrew poetry uses this idea of parallelism. And here we're going to see one of the characteristics of that parallelism in what is called a chiastic form, which the Greek word for the letter X is chi. And a chiastic poem, and I'll have a clip up for you in a minute so you can see this after I explain it, is diagrammed, and the diagram looks like an X, so that in an outline of this psalm, you can look at the first kind of statement is David praying in the confidence of the thanksgiving for his relationship with joy. And then as you continue diagram, there's another section, this parallelism of thought that begins, and it's actually an antithetical parallelism of the rejection of God and the wicked. And this is where the imprecatory nature of this psalm comes out. And then a third statement or third section comes up with a reminder for the psalmist, for themselves, of God's commitment to those righteous ones. And then we begin back again, paralleling these earlier thoughts with another section that parallels the wicked section, with a request for God to banish the rebels and the wicked and those that are unrighteous. And then yet another statement that comes back that reflects and talks about, again, the joy of God, the joy in the Lord. And so if you were to diagram it, it looks kind of like this, and that looks like the Greek letter X, and so that's how it gets the name chiastic. But it invites us to see how the psalmist builds his thoughts, and in parallel is conveying strong emotion, anger, perhaps at or a request from God to act on his behalf, while at the same time claiming and recognizing the specialness of the covenant relationship this psalmist David has with God and is in worship with him. It's interesting also, you'll note that if you are reading along with me, you'll see above the psalm, there's a title that is written for as an accompaniment, a flute for David. And this brings up another reason I like to use this psalm, that in the Hebrew, that word for accompaniment, musical accompaniment, or flute, depending on how your translation may have, is only found this one time in the Bible. So that makes it very difficult for translation. And so if you would look at possibly several different translations, they may have a little bit different. They may have musical instruments, they may say flute, or they may even say something like wind instruments. But again, it gives us both an indication of how this psalm was used in worship, accompanied by music, most likely a flute, perhaps some other form of wind instrument. But I liken it and parallel it to how often I leave worship and I'll be humming either a hymn in my mind and over that kind of thought going on, or a praise tune that I may be walking and thinking about, and it invites me into relationship, conversation with prayer with God. And that is how this psalm was being used in worship, but I think also for the invitation for us. Now, again, it's very difficult for us to kind of hum along. The original Psalter and the Psalter does have some musical notations. I don't read music, so I just read it in the language that it is. Finally, the other reason I've chosen this today is, as you will see, the psalmist talks about his orientation is the first thing he's doing in the morning is praying. This psalm, this prayer, gathers those thoughts as a focus for what his day is going to be. And it is also occurring as he's on the way to worship. We're going to see where he's going to. It most likely wasn't the temple if David wrote this originally, because the temple wasn't built until his son Solomon. May have been the tabernacle or the tent, the house of worship, or may have even been edited later after the temple was a part of the Jewish worship culture to reflect that. But I likened it because it reminds me again about the first things, making the first things first, so that as I orient, or as the psalm allows me to orient my own prayers in the morning, it is an orientation to God for the day. So as I look at this, let me first, as always, open us with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into this and talk a little bit about it. So here, let me pray. Father, we're gathered here in this morning, giving you thanks for the gift of life that I take for granted, but I want to celebrate in thanksgiving for that you've given the blessing, the richness, the gift of life, to have yet another day. Again, reminded later, your psalmist will write that this is enough, the day that you have given for us to worship you. And so, as we gather around your word, orient us around you and our life and our love of you, our relationship of you. Invite us by your Spirit's guidance now to hear these words, to claim them for ourselves, to be challenged in them, but more to grow in love and life with you. I pray in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen. So I'm reading again from the New American Standard Version, and invite you to hear these words of God for you. And as I often say within my own congregation, that I invite you to hear them, not necessarily to read along with them. Of course, you're welcome to read along with them, but the Bible is meant to be heard as much as it is meant to be read. And so hear or read these words of God. For the choir director, for flute accompaniment, a psalm of David. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Heed the sound of my cry for help, my King and my God, for to thee do I pray. In the morning, O Lord, thou wilt hear my voice, and in the morning I will order my prayer to thee and eagerly watch. It's an interesting term, this watch. It's used by Isaiah, and it means to be ready and looking as the night watch that's looking for something military activity. But it's an understanding of the activity of looking around and being very cognizant of what is to come. And to thee I eagerly watch. And here's where we begin this movement into this change of thought that's parallel, antithecally opposite of. But for thou art not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, no evil dwells with thee. The boastful shall not stand before thine eyes. Thou dost hate all who do iniquity. Thou dost destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the man of bloodshed and deceit. But as for me, and now we're working back, paralleling earlier thoughts. But as for me, by thine abundant loving kindness, I will enter thy house. At the holy temple, I will bow in reverence for thee. Again, making this parallel between wicked and righteous, claiming for himself the righteousness, the life in God that leads to worship as much better than the wicked and those whose life is filled with bloodshed and deceit, and by that are abhorrent to God in God's presence. The worship is inviting, or David is being invited, recognized into worship of God because he is righteous. And we'll have some more conversation about that. It continues now on the second half of the 7th verse. Again, this is kind of the anchor of the X. This is when you look at a chiastic poem, this is kind of where you get focused in on by the nature of the way it's oriented. But it says here, O Lord, lead me in thy righteousness because of my foes. Make thy way straight before me. There's nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Hold them guilty, O God. By their own devices, let them fall. And in the multitude of their transgressions, thrust them out. For they are rebellious against thee. But let all who take refuge in thee be glad. And again, we're setting up, this is opposite, making the comparison between the wicked and the unjust, and David in righteousness, and those who worship God rightly. But let all who take refuge in thee be glad. Let them ever sing for joy, and mayest thou shelter them, that those who love thy name may exalt in thee. For it is thou who dost bless the righteous man, O Lord. Thou dost surround them with favor, as with a shield. So part of what I want to unpack a little bit today is this understanding of this parallel between wicked and righteous. And I'm going to basically or briefly reflect on the imprecatory. I want to remind that in this case, and the reason I've chosen this as opposed to some perhaps we may see later, the judgment that's being invoked is not because of the wicked's reaction or dealing with David. I want to make sure that it's pointed out that David is calling upon God to recognize that their actions are abhorrent to God and therefore will lead to their judgment. So it's not so much as we will see in some others where it's a direct request by the psalmist, judge them, strike them down, even kill them, as it is a reflection upon because they have chosen to live this way, which is so contrary to the way God has shown how we are to live, based upon the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the right relationship with God that leads to a right relationship with others, and in an understanding of that 10 commandment, that Decalogue, when either one of those is out, either the vertical relationship of the individual with God or the horizontal relationship of man to man, person to person, it is a reflection of sin and sinfulness. So here the psalmist is basically proclaiming a self-evident truth that they seem to get away with a lot of things, that their life wickedness is oriented around bloodshed and deceit and taking pleasure in negative or deathly things. But that seems to be, as we will pick up in other parts of Psalms, doesn't seem to be right, because it's kind of back to the question of, or from not a recent song in our own culture, why did the wicked prosper, or why did the bad have all the fun? Is David is recognizing that their judgment is coming. And in a sense is reminding God also to do this. But it's meant here to be a parallel opposite to righteous living, which the psalmist, which David is claiming for himself as he worships God, as he recognizes God's protection, as he recognizes God's blessing, as he recognizes that his life is